Ukraine, which has been at the center of geopolitical tensions and conflict, received the lion's share of US assistance, totaling $43.076 billion. The funds were primarily directed toward economic development, peace and security, and humanitarian aid. Additionally, Ukraine received $1.068 billion to support democracy, human rights, and governance initiatives. Across all post-Soviet countries, economic development was the most heavily funded category, receiving $29.767 billion, or nearly 64% of the total assistance. Other significant areas of funding included peace and security and humanitarian aid. In contrast, despite the global push for climate action, environmental projects received minimal funding. Only $9.337 million was allocated across all countries. With Ukraine receiving the largest share, Ukraine dominated the funding landscape, with other countries receiving substantially less. Moldova was the second largest recipient, with $698.3 million, followed by Georgia, $663.8 million, and Tajikistan, $371.4 million. Armenia received $329.3 million, while Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan were allocated $261.9 million and $245.3 million respectively. At the lower end of the spectrum, Russia received the least amount of funding, totaling just $13.1 million, primarily for economic development and health initiatives. This reflects the strained relations between the US and Russia in recent years. The funding was distributed consistently over the 5-year period, with significant increases in certain categories during critical years. For example, Ukraine's economic development funding surged in 2022, reaching $8.605 billion as the country faced heightened conflict and economic challenges. Similarly, humanitarian aid to Ukraine peaked in 2022 at $1.190 billion, reflecting the urgent need for support following the escalation of the war. The US also prioritized democracy and governance programs across the region. Armenia received $122.2 million for democracy development, human rights and governance initiatives, while Georgia was allocated $160.7 million in this category. Belarus, on the backdrop of its strained relations with the West, received $62.8 million for similar programs. The US was prioritizing Ukraine in its foreign aid agenda, especially following Russia's full-scale invasion in February 2022. The Biden administration had framed this assistance as critical to supporting Ukraine's sovereignty and countering Russian aggression. However, the sheer scale of funding to Ukraine, over 90% of the total aid to post-Soviet countries, has sparked debates about the effectiveness and equity of US aid distribution. Critics argue that the overwhelming focus on Ukraine has come at the expense of other post-Soviet states that also face significant economic, political, and security challenges. For instance, Moldova and Georgia, both of which have struggled with Russian influence and internal instability, received less than $700 million each over the 5-year period. Moreover, the lack of significant funding for environmental initiatives across the region raises concerns about the long-term sustainability of US aid. With climate change posing a growing threat to the region, the minimal allocation of $9.3 million for environmental projects appears disproportionate to the scale of the challenge. Some analysts argue that the distribution of US aid has been strategically directed towards sectors that amplify American soft power in the region. Programs focused on democracy, governance, and economic development are seen as tools to promote US values and influence, particularly in countries like Ukraine, Georgia, and Armenia, which have expressed aspirations for closer ties with the West. However, this approach has drawn criticism for prioritizing geopolitical interests over the immediate needs of local populations, such as healthcare, education, and environmental sustainability. The future of US foreign aid to the region remains uncertain, particularly with the Trump administration's policies. The US president raised serious skepticism toward foreign aid, pushing for significant cuts and emphasizing a more transactional approach to international relations. As a result, many of the US-funded programs in post-Soviet countries, particularly those reliant on consistent financial support, are facing disruption or termination. This raises critical questions about the sustainability of projects that depend on US funding. For example, initiatives aimed at strengthening democratic institutions, supporting civil society, or rebuilding infrastructure in conflict-affected areas like Ukraine are left in limbo. Similarly, countries like Moldova and Georgia, which have relied on US assistance to counter Russian influence and bolster their economies, may struggle to fill the funding gap.